All right, so it's been about 2 years since the last Dream Theater album, and I think it's about time for a new one. And much like clockwork, here we are. And I know a lot of people are wondering, is this one going to be their grand return to form, or is this one going to be more of the same that we've had pretty much for the last decade? Well, let's find out. A View from the Top of the World by Dream Theater. So, Dream Theater, I don't think they really need an introduction at this point. They're the ones that really kickstarted and trailblazed the big progressive movement within the metal music of the late 80s, early 90s, and like trailblazed and innovated the whole progressive metal movement that we would then see within the 2000s, taking inspiration from the prog legends of Queensryche and Fate's Warning, blending a lot more of the kind of more meaty metal approach that we had from a lot of the big four thrash metal bands of like Anthrax and Metallica, and Megadeth, and all that. Dream Theater themselves have had quite an interesting discography. I mean, this is their 15th full-length album, and it is now their 5th album without the founding drummer of Mike Portnoy. There's a few criticisms about this album that I want to get out of the way right off the gates, because it's been the same kind of criticisms that we've had since 2011 of A Dramatic Turn of Events, which is really 10 years ago. There's really like 3 major criticisms that each of these subsequent albums from Dream Theater have had, starting with their self-titled one, The Astonishing and Distance Over Time. The first one that I want to get out of the way right away is my main one that I've had since the beginning, which is the drummer that they replaced Mike Portnoy with, which was Mike Mangini. And I've said right from the beginning, he's an amazing timekeeper. You know, he is able to play fast, he's able to keep time, but in terms of innovation, I've always felt like there has been something lacking in his playing styles. And for a studio drummer, that's not needed. You know, you just need somebody to keep time. You just need somebody to play tunes and keep pace with the masters that are John Petrucci and Jordan Rudess. Even though that's still present here, I do feel as though it's not as much of a sore thumb. This one's probably his best playing to date. This is my favorite album that I've had with him at the helm in terms of the drumming styles. And there's not too many moments on this album that I feel like his presence is a hindrance to the band. If anything, he is able to put down quite a number of really, really tasty rhythm styles, some really great intricate drum playing. There are so many moments on this album where I'm like, I'm loving what I'm hearing in terms of the drumming styles. And I wouldn't think that I would be able to say that on a Dream Theater album without Portnoy behind the drums. The other one is James LeBray's voice. You know, we know that he can no longer hit those soaring high notes that he once did on the earlier part of his career, and that's fine. And I feel like, much like Distance Over Time, where he's not trying to reach those high notes that he once was, you know, he's not trying to stretch too hard. I feel like he's really playing within his own sandbox and really unearthing how he's able to create his dynamic ranges that he once did. He's using a lot more overlays within harmonizing with himself. At no point does it ever feel overreaching. It always feels very, very natural. So the two bigger gripes that I've had on past albums, I feel have been more than addressed and been a very highlighted aspect of this. So this leaves the other 3 members of the band that I want to at least touch upon before I dive into the individual tracks on this album. I still feel as though Jordan Rudess's playing is outstanding. I still feel as though he's playing off of John Petrucci rather than being his own star. A lot of times on here, like, it's either playing almost devil's advocate or he's trying to play off of some of the licks that John is putting down, or he's utilizing the atmosphere. And that is something that Jordan really gets overlooked in terms of his musical playing styles. Yes, he can play like 1,000 notes per second, but he's also very good at capturing the atmosphere. And a lot of that is done through his own innovation work on his own like software apps and using all these different soundscapes to create such interesting music. There's a lot of moments that you think is a full orchestra that it's really just an audio app that he's configured to his own whims. John Petrucci's style of playing is just as you would expect. I don't feel as though there's any moment on here that soars higher than any other piece that he's ever really put down. The introduction of the 8-string guitar now, I believe it is 7 or 8. It might be 7, could be 8. I thought that was really good. You have a lot more of that chunky sound. It sounds a lot more down-tuned at times, especially on the first couple of tracks off this album. At no point did it ever really completely wow me. Like, no solo really like tipped the bar for me. No moment on here did I ever go, wow, that's amazing, especially with his legacy of work behind him. All of it was just very serviceable. And John Mayung, I still feel as though he's lost within the mix. There's only maybe one moment on this entire album that I can hear him. Everything else, he is lost within the mix. It's lost within the playing time with John Petrucci. And that's essentially what John Mayung does, is he just kind of plays the same thing that John Petrucci does, which is fine if that's what you want out of your music. But I remember back in the olden days, and I feel like the old man yells at clouds, back in my day, we used to be able to hear the bass work on here. And it wasn't really until I put on like really good headphones and listened to this album that some of his bass work was able to be heard outside of the mix. I think the biggest flaw about this album is still kind of the biggest flaw from most of the albums that we've had lately of Dream Theater, -1, which is kind of the lack of direction and lack of a concept. The only one that had a direction and a concept was The Astonishing, and that might have been the weakest flaw of that album. But it just feels like it's a collection of tracks that have been compiled onto an album. And there really doesn't seem to be any real forethought. There doesn't seem to be any kind of guiding light for this album. It's just kind of track after track after track, which is fine. But when you had a legacy of albums that each album had a very crystal clear thought before they even stepped foot into the recording studio, or even as they were in the recording studio, a guiding light had brought forth the through line for the album. This one doesn't really seem to have one. And this is something that I thought was the biggest weakness of Distance Over Time and their self-titled work, because I honestly haven't returned to those albums. And that being said, I've returned to The Astonishing. I listen to The Astonishing maybe once or twice a year, sometimes even more, because even though it's overblown and overlong, I still find a lot of energy and a lot of inspiration from it because of the through line of that album. And that's the biggest weakness that I feel with View from the Top of the World. It just feels like a collection of tracks, which is doubly a shame because of some of the through lines that are here, but the threads get lost along the way. And a lot of that is the concept of being other, this concept of being removed, this concept of being almost like a demon or a monster. And we see that with tracks like The Alien, The Invisible Monster, Sleeping Giant, Awaken the Master, and even a little bit with the title track of The View from the Top of the World. Like, each of these deal with the idea of being other, being an alien, having this invisible monster after you, this sleeping giant, right? Like, they all have this kind of concept of the other. And A View from the Top of the World has that being able to essentially see things with the grand scale of things. Being othered means you're not entrenched into whatever it is that they're talking about, so that they can get the grand scope and see things from all the different facets and getting a full picture, the full view. Unfortunately, that is lost and muddled with tracks like Answering the Call and Transcending Time, which loses that thread. Like, it's completely ripped out of your hand as you're starting to pick it up. So I do feel like that's probably the weakest aspect of this album, and one that doesn't beg for me to return to the album, which is a little bit of a shame, because the music that's found on this is probably some of the best music that Dream Theater has written since Black Clouds and Silver Linings. Specifically, the mid track, the crowning jewel of Sleeping Giant, is probably my favorite track off this entire album, and that includes the final, View from the Top of the World, the big 20-minute track. This one's the second longest at 10 minutes, but I feel like the ebb and flow of this track is beautiful. I love how they build it up to kind of hint towards the big kind of crescendo moment. So they build it up and then skirt away from it, build it up the second time, go for it. And so by the third time, when you build it up, it's kind of the repeating of thirds, you expect that big crescendo and it delivers that. And I really, really enjoy that big crescendo. I love Petrucci's soaring guitar works on there. It's reminiscing of some of the better moments from Systematic Chaos. We're getting those really juicy overlays of tones that Rudess is really putting down. I'm loving James LeBray's vocals on this. Everything is coming together in such a brilliant package, and a lot of that is delivered with the build-up and the payoff of this track. So going a little bit deeper into this album, the album opens off with The Alien, which was the first single off of the album, and I thought it did a great job of opening up this album. It was meaty, it was fast, it was very fast-paced. It was reminding me a little bit of the jam sessions that we had from Systematic Chaos without sacrificing the over complexity with grit and soul. Unfortunately, it didn't really have too much teeth, and it didn't have like a singular hook to want me to come back to it. And that same can be said with Answering the Call, which essentially does what a Dream Theater track does at this point. You know, the one thing that I do like is that meteor guitars with the extra strings on it that John is playing. It provides a really great bottom that I've already mentioned before. This is a great example of that. I do like the play out a little bit with John and Rudess coming together a little bit on that, but it didn't really surprise me as much as I was hoping to. So by the time we get to the third track of Invisible Monsters, this is where like I really hear that Are You Afraid of the Dark theme to it. And a lot of this is the pairing of the higher guitars that John is playing with the soundscapes and really interesting tones that Jordan is experimenting with. These two blend together that really create this creepier atmosphere that like the Invisible Monster is needed, but also that brings that same atmosphere that Are You Afraid of the Dark has. And so it made sense that this track was kind of the second leading single because it's a shorter track at 6.5 minutes. It's punchy, it's catchy, but it never really gets that same kind of catchy style that a lot of the earlier singles had, like Forsaken or Panic Attack. And then we come into Sleeping Giant, which I already talked about. I really, really like that track. I think it's my favorite one. Unfortunately, we get into my least favorite track on the album, which is Transcending Time. This feels like it was a track that was found off of the self-titled work from tracks such as like The Looking Glass, and it just doesn't look well on an album like this. Like this album overall is much darker, it's meatier, it's very bombastic and heavy metal. This slower, more in a major chord, just kind of felt off on these bigger, harsher tracks. I know this was kind of like a respite of all those other tracks, and it's trying to be like a breath of fresh air at the midpoint in terms of the runtime, but for me, it just kind of left me cold. I am glad that this is the shortest track at almost 6.5 minutes, but it doesn't really do anything for me. I know that Dream Theater loves to have these more sentimental tracks on this, but here it just feels like a sore thumb. And if we want to talk about punch, it's definitely picked up with Awaken the Master. I always want to say that this is Awaken the Monster, but it's Awaken the Master. And for me, it almost feels like the continuation of A Dark Eternal Night from Systematic Chaos. A lot of that is that more chuggy guitar that John Petrucci is playing. I like the fact that this is one of the few tracks that John Mayung can actually be felt and found on here. I really enjoyed that. And I love some of the playouts. I just wish that this track ended on a better note because it just kind of played out in that same kind of Dream Theater playout session that we've already heard before. So then we come to the title track. Now we come to the big 20-minute massive thing, A View from the Top of the World. Honestly, this one is a lot more transitory. There doesn't seem to be too much of a through line within this one. They just kind of go from section to section to section that it's fine, but it doesn't feel all that tied together. Yeah, I mean, it builds itself up to get to a plateau, to build itself up again. And I like after so many of these 20-minute monsters that Dream Theater have created, and this is the first one since the Illumination Theory, I honestly prefer the Illumination Theory to that. Like, even though the Illumination Theory was just a ripoff of the Count of Tuscany, I still preferred that one because it had these very crystal clear moments on this one, and this just feels kind of lackluster. The big final crescendo at the end of this track is fine, but it gets overshadowed by this trip up playoff. Like, when we get this final crescendo at the end of this track, I'm like, okay, this is interesting. This is good. You know, this is what I really like about Dream Theater, is this big emotion at the end that then kind of trips over its feet when we get into this more complex time signature playout that I wasn't all that interested or excited about. So yeah, in the end though, I know I've kind of talked down to this album quite a bit though, I still feel like this album is a great album from Dream Theater. I wouldn't necessarily put it in the top tier of Dream Theater's albums, but this is probably my favorite album upon first listening since A Dramatic Turn of Events. This is probably going to end up in the same camp that Distance Over Time was, where while I was listening to it, it was an interesting and fun listen, but there's nothing really to keep me coming back to it. I honestly will return to the Liquid Tension experiment that came out earlier this year, because at least that had more of a heart to it, had more of a through line that this one seemed to lack. So that's kind of where I'm sitting with this. I know that, you know, this album will probably be the same well received as Distance Over Time, if not probably a little bit better than Distance Over Time. But yeah, for me, it's probably about the same rating. A View from the Top of the World from Dream Theater gets a download. And that's what I've got. So what did you guys think? Did you love this album? Did you hate this album? Where would you kind of rate it? Let me know by commenting down below. If you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've left the link down below. Even $1 a month does go a long way. So that's all I've got. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.